The Apollo moon landings were a hoax. Apollo 11 never took place. Humans have never walked on the moon. Have you heard anything like this before? In the 50 years after Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took their first tiny steps on the lunar surface, conspiracy theories about the moon landings have remained unsettlingly persistent. And now the former director of the Russian space agency doubts that man ever set foot on the moon. But first, let us examine what motivates the inconsistencies. First, look at this image. Do you notice something about the shadows? They're not parallel. Conspiracy theorists have used this photograph to prove that the moon landings were staged. Shouldn't the shadows be parallel if the sun were the only light source? Isn't this evidence that the entire scenario was staged in a studio, with several light sources producing diverse shadow patterns? NASA explained that this is on the moon's surface, but we can make this happen on Earth whenever we want to. You have most likely all seen this effect, in which lines next to each other look like they're not next to each other because of how you look at them. If you try to put a three-dimensional situation on a two-dimensional plane, lines can do all kinds of strange things. Artists have used this for hundreds of years. You would see this for yourself by going outside when the sun is low in the sky. Like the pictures from Apollo 11, the shadows won't be straight. But even with that, questions remain. Another interesting theory is that the radiation field around Earth would have killed the Apollo crew. The Van Allen radiation belt is a band of charged particles that surrounds the Earth. These are places in our magnetic field around the Earth where high-energy particles from the sun tend to get trapped. That means you should be very worried about radiation if you plan to go to space. But how did the Apollo astronauts get through the Van Allen radiation belt and out of Earth's orbit without getting sick? They must have died from the amount of radiation, right? Doesn't this show that the landings on the moon were a lie? Well, NASA's response to this was quite simple. That was what was thought back then, and it didn't happen to the Apollo astronauts. Which means they predicted wrong. So then, why don't these pictures of the NASA moon landings show any stars? Here's another picture of the moon landing that has caught the eye of people who don't believe it happened. If the picture was taken on the moon, the sky should be full of stars, right? After all, there is no air to affect the picture and no clouds that block that beautiful view. Some people say that the fact that there are no stars in the Apollo 11 mission photos proves that the event was faked. NASA couldn't fake the full beauty of the moon's sky, so they didn't put any stars in the picture. Not forgetting that people would use the stars to deduce whether the pictures were taken from Earth or the moon. Here's the explanation. The sun shines brightly on humans and the lunar surface. Even though the sky looks black, it is daytime on the moon. If you want to take a picture of a scene with a lot of light, the shutter speed on your camera needs to be fast, and the lens needs to be very small. In that case, you won't be able to see things like stars that are far away. But here comes the big question. Why haven't we been back to the moon since 1969 if we really went there? In 1972, Apollo 17 was the last Apollo mission to land people on the moon. Since then, no one has ever been back. Maybe that's because we've never been to the moon. Of course, Apollo 17 wasn't supposed to be the end of the story. During the 1970s, there were plans to build a permanent base on the moon before moving on to Mars, the next big space research challenge. But it didn't happen. The main argument is that if we did have the technology to go to the moon back in the day, shouldn't it be easier now since technology is only advancing? Well, that's true, but even with that, politics are also involved, which is one of the biggest reasons we've never done it again. It makes you think, what is wrong with humanity if simple politics can limit space exploration? Instead, the focus shifted to the Space Shuttle program and more recently the International Space Station, where humans have lived full-time since November 2000. But that doesn't mean people could never go back to the moon. We could go on about other arguments, such as why the flag was waving since there's no atmosphere to make it do that, but let's shift our focus to a former director of the Russian space agency, who is certain that this never happened. Dmitri Rogozin, who used to run the Russian space agency, doesn't believe people went to the moon in 1969. On his official Telegram channel, the official said that he asked for proof of the Apollo 11 journey before he came to work at Roscosmos. His argument is still the same. He doesn't understand why NASA could do this since it hasn't been able to do it again in 50 years. He said that about 10 years ago, when he worked for the government, he asked Roscosmos in a formal letter to show him proof that the Americans had been on the moon. He said that he was deeply embarrassed by the fact that Soviet cosmonauts, who'd been on long trips, could barely stand up when they returned. The previous head of the space agency couldn't believe that Armstrong and Aldrin were moving so well after leaving the lunar module. Even though he insisted, the request did not turn out how he thought it would. Dmitri Rogozin said the agency sent him a book in which cosmonaut Alexei Leonov stated that people had set foot on the moon. Leonov, who would be the first person from the Soviet Union to walk on the moon, said that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did it because they told themselves so. Years later, Rogozin would be in charge of Roscosmos, turning it into a space body that could compete with others. While he was in charge, the director kept looking for proof of trips to the moon, but he found nothing. The official said that the questions only got him criticism from academics and colleagues for undermining sacred cooperation with NASA, and a top Russian manager told him to do something about it. The previous head of Roscosmos doesn't believe the official story of how people got to the moon. Some people actually think that NASA faked the landing on the moon to beat the Soviet Union in the space race, which again revolves around one of humanity's biggest challenges: politics. Dmitri is an old-school patriot who wants to bring back the glory of the USSR, so it's not strange that he says things like this. During his time in charge of Roscosmos, the manager did things like promise to kill Elon Musk and leave an astronaut alone on the International Space Station. Rogozin doesn't doubt that Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins went to the moon, but he does doubt that they were able to land there. The former head of the Russian Space Agency says that people like Eugene Alexandrov, a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, have goals similar to those of the United States. Alexandrov, who works for the Pseudoscience Commission to support scientific knowledge, was very critical of Rogozin when he asked for proof of the moon landing in 2018. He doesn't have a job or any power at the moment, but that doesn't stop him from talking about his memories and ideas on his Telegram channel. However, even with all this, a simple device that Apollo 11 put on the moon 50 years ago is said to be the best piece of evidence that the moon landing wasn't faked. Armstrong and Aldrin put a lunar laser range retroreflector array on the surface of the moon while they were there for a day. And it is said to still work today, and we can use it to measure the distance to the moon to the nearest centimeter by reflecting light off of it. We wouldn't be able to do this at all if we had never been to the moon.